and want to thank particularly the people that have brought the little ones. They are truly the future of our past.
No. Yeah, it wouldn't work with that. We'll get a shot of Mr. President, Mr. John. Okay, very good.
Nope, you gotta stay there a minute.
Yeah, give us slow folks a chance.
Of course, we got the wrong flag in the background.
Oh.
Move over here.
Yeah,
Scurry, scurry.
good.
Much better.
Would anybody else like to take a photograph before we begin?
General, they don't have the cameras that we're used to. The big cameras that take 30, 60, 90 seconds to take a photograph. They say these little devices capture our image, and they also double as a wireless telegraph.
Go on.
Yeah, I saw them, and I went to Secretary Stanton and said, we need to purchase some of these for the Army. And he said he didn't believe that there was such a thing in existence. So if one of you wouldn't mind giving me your device so we can show the Secretary. We'll pay top dollar, $13, $14.
Yeah.
Well, my future self.
Thank you. It's 1869. I've just been elected President of the United States in the 1868 election. Took 214 electoral votes to 80 for Governor Horatio Seymour of New York. The state of Tennessee gave me all 10 of their electoral votes. I thank them for that. But I sit here thinking, how in the world did I get to be President of the United States? I was born in a log cabin in Point Pleasant, Ohio, along the Ohio River. Although I like to brag, I was born in a 2-room log cabin, and Lincoln was only born in a 1-room log cabin. My father owned and operated a tannery. Now, many of you moderns may not have even heard of a tannery. It's a place where you convert cowhides into leather goods, which is a very important industry on the frontier. Boots, saddles, satchels, leather goods of all sorts. And I don't know if you've ever been in a tannery, but it's not a very pleasant place. As a young boy, I was ordered by my father, Jesse, to work in his tannery. He gives me the worst job in the place. I have to scrape the cowhides, the fur hair on one side, and the blood and the guts and the fat on the inside to scrape them off. Dirty, smelly job, and I told my father, I hate this job, and I would never do it again when I got older. And I said, why don't you give me another job? You know, like what? I said, well, I'm good with horses. Why don't you give me a job with a horse, like delivering goods? And he thought about it for a minute, and being a good businessman, he says, I'll let you do it on one condition, that you earn your own money to buy your own horse. Sold. And now I'm scraping harder and faster than ever and saving every penny. Finally, I had accumulated $25. Now this is 1833, that's worth a lot more, of course. And I asked my father if I could buy a horse. I found a feller in town who'd sell me his horse for $25. And he says to me, "That's an awful lot of money to be spending. You first need to negotiate the price." I hadn't heard of that word negotiate. What's that mean? Well, if he wants $25, offer him 20. And then see if we can get the price down to 20. And then if he doesn't take that, offer him $22.50. You know, point out some bad things about the horse, you know, like it has a sway back or teeth or something. So get that price down. But if that doesn't work, then and only then do you pay the $25. Do you understand? I said, "Yes, Papa, I think I do. But I devised my own negotiating strategy." I got the money out, and I went up to the feller, and I stuck the money right under his nose so he could smell it. And I says to him, "My father says to offer you $20 for your horse. And if you don't take that, $22.50. And if you don't take that, $25. You can imagine what I paid for the horse. $25. And when I told my father, he just shook his head and he said, "You're never going to be any good at business, are you, Ulysses?" And he was right. I've never been any good at business. And so when I got old enough, my father was figuring out a way to get me some kind of education. I wanted to do something in the technical range, like teach mathematics. But this is 1839, and there's not a lot of colleges around the country that teach technical curriculum. If you want to be a doctor or a lawyer or teacher or preacher, there's a college, but there's not many otherwise. But he finds out there is one in upstate New York called the U.S. Military Academy. And my friend, Bart Bailey, had just flunked out.
Well, my father knew I didn't want to go into the family business, and he asked me, "What would you like to do?" And I said, "Well, I'd like to be a riverboat man." And Father told me later after this conversation that he had less confidence in me being on the river than he did me being in the tannery business. And, "Well, what if you didn't do that? What would you do?" And I said, "Well, I could always go to school. I'm good at math." Now, Bart Bailey was my best friend. He was the son of Dr. George Bailey, and they lived in the White House on the hill behind the two-story brick house that I grew up in. Lived there from the time I was 11 months old until I left for the academy, which, by the way, I did not know I was going to the academy. But the Baileys had built this Grecian temple white house with tall, soaring columns on the front of the house, a stone's throw behind the house I grew up in. And Bart was a year older than I was, and he was the best friend I ever had. Father had heard, I didn't know about this, that Bart he'd gone to West Point the year before this conversation took place about my going, and Bart had been asked to leave. And it was such a disappointment to his father that Dr. Bailey told him, "Don't come home." And Bart did not come home. The closest he came to Georgetown, which is 10 miles away from the Ohio River, was when he floated down the Ohio River that spring, and he went out to California to seek his fortune. Did not come back. But I would have you know that the irony of the best friend I ever had, his failure created the opening for me to get into the United States Military Academy. The failure of my best friend created the opening. And there are those who would tell you that my getting into West Point changed the history of the country. That's not for me to say. But Father heard that Bart had failed been asked to leave. So he immediately applied to the Senator Morris, to get an appointment to the United States Military Academy, because Father knew that with the country exploding to the west, hundreds of thousands of people flooding to the west, that the man who could build the infrastructure, the roads, the bridges, the buildings for this exploding new country, he'd always have a living assured. And he knew I wasn't going to work in the tannery. The only college in America at that time that gave an engineering degree was the United States Military Academy. So Father applied to Morris for me to go. Well, Senator Morris, who was a good longtime friend of Father considered himself a politician. He really wasn't, but he liked to think of himself as a politician. He told Jesse, my father, Jesse, I don't have any appointments, but I'll tell you who does, Tom Hamer. Now, Tom Hamer might be a man that you've never heard of. He's one of those people, unfortunately, that slid down in between the pages of the books, off the history book page, through no fault of his own, just the passage of time. But Tom Hamer was a congressman from the little area of Georgetown, Ohio, where I grew up. And Tom had come into Georgetown as a teacher. He read law, became a lawyer. He got into the Ohio State House. In fact, was the Speaker of the Ohio State House of Representatives. Got elected to Congress. He was in his third term in Congress and was rumored to be the Speaker of the House of Representatives in Washington City. But the problem was that about 10 years earlier, when I was a tot, about 6 years old, Father and Tom Hamer were in a debate society, and they almost came to blows over the National Bank and Andrew Jackson. Well, they hadn't spoken to each other in 10 years. Now, that's really hard to do when you're in a town of 1,500 people with 22 buildings. But they worked at it, and they didn't speak to each other. So when Father writes the letter, the second irony of my life occurred in this sequence, that Tom Hamer got the letter from my father on the last day he was in office, because Tom had not run for re-election. And he was cleaning out his office. He had to be out of the office that day. Now, I ask you, search yourselves of the times that you have moved and you had to be out of the house that day. Did you ever stop and read your mail? I think not. But Tom Hamer did. So he goes through his mail and he found this letter from Jesse Grant. Hadn't spoken to Jesse Grant 10 years. And my father said some hard things about Tom Hamer. Hard things about Tom in the local newspaper, The Castigator. And I'm still trying to figure out why anybody would name a newspaper The Castigator. But Tom was also known as the Good Samaritan. Very forgiving man. So he sat down and wrote the appointment letter to me that day. He couldn't wait till the next day, he wouldn't be in office. So the second great irony, what if that letter had lain in a mail sack in a rail car? What if Father had written it a day later? What if Tom had gotten it the day after he left office, but he got it the last day he's in office? And he wrote my appointment, and that's where I got my name changed, because my name is Hiram Ulysses Grant. Did you know my first name's Hiram? It's not Ulysses. Tom Hamer didn't know that, because he hasn't spoken to Father in 10 years. He knew my name was Ulysses, because people called me useless. I never cared much for the name Ulysses, because it's so easily useless. So he put down Ulysses as my first name. He thought my middle name was my mother's maiden name of Simpson. And to further complicate things, he didn't write Simpson, he wrote S. period. So he wrote my appointment papers Ulysses S. Grant, and that went to the United States Military Academy. And there's two things I would tell you in this tale of getting into the academy. Well, my father told me in the night, one night in December of 1838, I was 16 years old, and I was going to be 17 in April. And Father said, my 4 siblings, the 5th one's under Mama's apron at the end of the table, born 2 months after I left for the academy. But Father says, you've got it, Ulysses, I've got the letter. And I said, I'm 16 years old, I'm eating dinner and raking the food in. I said, and I'm not expecting anything of moment. And I said, God, what? He said, why, the appointment to the United States Military Academy. I have the letter. And I said, well, I won't go. Every one of you in here, at one time in your lives, at least one time in your lives, said something to your parents that you immediately knew you should not have said that. Such a moment for me. I see some people nodding and testifying. After what seemed an hour, Father put down his fork and he leaned across that table at me and he said, in that tone of voice, now every one of you in here, you have heard that tone of voice. It came out of a different mouth and it said different words, but you heard it. Have you ever? I see people nodding. You heard that voice, and my Father said, I think you will. And by this time I've remembered myself, and I said, well, if you think I will, then I think I will. And I was off to the academy. I would finish this part of my anecdote by telling you when I got to the academy, I went into the administrative office, and Charles Ferguson Smith, another man whose name has slid into the bindings between the history book pages, was the captain of commandants, or commandant of students. He was Captain Smith. He later became General Smith under my command. And Captain Smith was 6 feet 4 inches tall and as thin as a rail. And he's sitting there behind the table, and I reported, and he said, Mr. Grant, we've been looking for you. There was another Grant that was in that class in the spring of 1839. 100 cadets showed up. And one of them was a Grant from New York State. He was one of the first to drop out. But Captain Smith said, we've been waiting for you, Ulysses S. Grant. And I said, well, actually, that's not my name. He said, yes, it is. And I said, no, my name is Hiram Ulysses. No, the United States Army says your name is Ulysses S. Grant, and Ulysses S. Grant you are. Now, if your mother and father want to call you Hiram, they can go down to the courthouse and change it. But this is an official United States War Department document, and I cannot change it. And I thought, he's right, he can't. So I thought, well, I'll get it changed before I graduate, which I really didn't think would ever happen. I was greatly surprised when it did. But that's when I got my name changed to Ulysses S. Grant. My real name my birth name is Hiram Ulysses Grant. And I got the nickname of Sam because Sherman, and I've seen Sherman around here. Sherman is the one who said, well, looks like we got ourselves Uncle Sam Grant. Sherman was in his 4th year when I was in my 1st. And he denies that he did it, but he did. For a while they called me United States Grant, and for a while they called me Uncle Sam Grant, and then that got shortened to Sam. So that's my nickname. So if we see each other again, please address me as Sam. And if you do so, then I will know that we have met. But that's the tale, as I look back and remember, of how I got from Georgetown, Ohio to the United States Military Academy through the failure of Bart Bailey, my best friend. And I would have you know, though, that there's a happy ending somewhat. Bart and his father reconciled. Bart came back to Georgetown, studied medicine under his father, George Bailey, and became a very successful doctor in his own right, and moved to Ripley, Ohio, just in Aberdeen, Ohio, a few miles away. But he was killed in October of '61. He was in West Virginia. He'd become a colonel in a West Virginia regiment, and in a small fight he was killed. So he was killed, one of the early war casualties. Bart Bailey.
Indeed. Again, how did I become president of the United States? And my life is just full of ironies. You've heard a few already. West Point, I'd say early on in my career there, I was actually hoping that Congress was considering closing it, and I was hoping they would. But as time went on, I got to more and more appreciate my education there. Oh, I took military classes, of course, but those were my least favorite. I enjoyed the mathematics classes, of course, and the horsemanship classes they had there, I excelled in, of course. And then they had me take a class that I never understood why, called landscape drawing. Why would I take a landscape drawing? Turned out I really enjoyed it. I could do well at landscape drawing, but I always laughed, why would you send a soldier to take that class? But it turned out that was one of the most important education items for me during the war, because when you take landscape drawing, you learn perspective. You're drawing trees and roads and hills, and what do soldiers, generals do? They need to assess their positions. Where is the enemy going to attack? What do we need to defend? How can we transport our troops? So it worked out very well. Time for graduation. Now I'm somewhere in the middle of my class. I think 21 out of 39. We lost over half our class at that point. And I'm thinking, I'm the best horseman they've had at West Point. Could ride faster and jump higher than any other cadet ever. As a matter of fact, at graduation ceremonies, they had me demonstrate this for the crowd. And they posted the assignments after graduation, figuring I'm a shoo-in for the dragoons, which is cavalry. The top graduates become engineers. They learn how to build fortifications and bridges and so forth. Next down is artillery. You need to be smart mathematically to figure out a projectile's course. Then was the cavalry, and finally infantry. So I'm looking for me, and I'm not showing up in the cavalry. I look further down, they put me in the infantry. The infantry, and worse yet, I'm assigned to the quartermaster. That's a supply officer. Can it get any worse? Well, it turned out, ironically, the best thing that could have happened for me. Because supply officers know how the Army runs. They know exactly what it needs: equipment, ammunition, food, uniforms, how many and when to get them. And you can do that on a scale from a regiment, brigade, army. And as quartermaster, it turned out that during the American Civil War, the highest ranking Union generals were quartermasters, not engineers. Myself, General Sherman, General Thomas, General Sheridan, General Ord, these are the top generals, quartermasters. So even though I thought I got the worst assignment, it turned out to the best. And shortly following graduation, I'll skip meeting my wife and so forth, but we ended up in the Mexican War. I was assigned an early part of the war to General Taylor, Zachary Taylor, who later became president, of course. But he ran the army in the North Mexico. Taylor had a more relaxed attitude toward his uniform and the way he ran his army. But I got to study him and his command. He was a good general. And I was then transferred to General Scott's army in central Mexico. And he had just the opposite attitude toward uniforms. As much brass and gold he could put on his uniform, he took. But he was also a very competent general. One of the things he had done in moving from Veracruz, the port, toward Mexico City, he decides to cut his supply line. What does that mean for quartermasters? We got to figure out how to supply his army with the supply line cut. So I learned to negotiate with the local populace, and we were able to sufficiently keep the army in supplies. But I studied his tactics, and how did he do this, cut his supply line? And later on, I was able to emulate that during the American Civil War, particularly at the Vicksburg campaign. So General Scott and General Taylor, I had a chance to be in both armies. In fact, somebody told me I was the only officer who fought in all 10 of the major battles. Every battle we were outnumbered, but we won every one. And I was able to understand that why after studying their tactics. And you say, wait a minute, you just told me you were a quartermaster officer. How did you end up fighting in all the battles? Well, what I would do is I would supply my regiment prior to the battle, assign the sergeant to take over for me, then I ran, or usually with a horse, went down to the front line and waited for one of our officers to be shot down. Then I rode in and took his place. So as such, I was able to fight in all 10 battles and won 3 brevet promotions for that. So the Mexican War ironically turned out to be a very educational learning ground for me. And I also got to meet that Tom Hamer fellow was mentioned.
Well, I had talked about, in thinking out loud with you about Tom Hamer, but I should like to reflect back a moment about West Point. The class of 43, I was 21 out of 39. I like to think of it as being in the top half of the bottom half. But our instructors, the staff at West Point, described us as the most lackluster class that had ever graduated from the United States Military Academy. Not a good send-off. But when I went to Mexico, we spent those 2 years, and I learned much with General Taylor, General Scott. But a poignancy for me was that in the winter of 47, we'd gotten into Mexico City. We'd taken Mexico City, and we thought the war, for all practical purposes, was over. It turned out that it wasn't quite, but I was in Mexico City, and lo, it came to pass that Brigadier General Thomas Hamer appears with our regiment. And Tom Hamer had been appointed by the governor of Ohio as a volunteer brigadier general. So now Hamer, who was a wonderful man, very astute man, is now a general in command of troops in a combat zone. So once he found out where I was, and he was seeking me out, he called me to his quarters. Now by this time I'm a second lieutenant. And Congressman General Hamer called me to his quarters, and I went in, and he said, have a seat. So we're sitting in his tent, and I said, what can I do for you, Tom? Congressman, General. Now this is the man that's appointed me to the academy. So there's something of the full circle being completed here, because he appointed me to the academy. Now we're sitting in Mexico City or near Mexico City, and Hamer is asking me to teach him combat tactics. He said, I don't know anything about leading men in battle. I don't know anything about leading men in an army at all. I need your help, Liz, if you will. And after I got over my shock, if I hadn't been sitting down, I'd have had to sit down. I said, well, certainly. So he said, be discreet about this and don't talk about it. But nightly, you come to my tent and you're going to teach me. And I did. And for a number of nights, we would actually go outside the camp and we would have mock battles. And I would be the enemy and he would be the Army, the U.S. Army, and I would talk him through what I'm going to do. What do you do? And he would say what he thought, and I would correct him and say, no, you would think that as a civilian, but in the military thinking, you don't do that, you do this. And I've got to say, Tom was a fast learner. He was a good student and learned quickly, and I could see, I had to suppress a smile on a number of occasions when I saw him drilling or leading troops on the move, and I'd have to just cover a smile because he was doing what I taught him the night before. So he'd go out in the field and put into practice, and I watched him grow as an infantry leader, and he was deeply grateful, and I never said anything about it. Unfortunately, Tom got the fever, or a fever, in Mexico City and died. In fact, he was already slated to be going home. He contracted the fever, and in just a few days, he died. And I don't think he'd mind me telling you, he wanted to be buried in Georgetown, and he is indeed, has a wonderful obelisk in Friendship Cemetery to this day in Georgetown, Ohio. And what they had to do with him, though, was they got a barrel and put him in his body in the barrel, kind of folded him up and filled it full of whiskey and sealed it. A lot of men went home from that war, in a barrel of whiskey because it's one of the best preservatives to prevent decay that you can get. So they put him in a barrel of whiskey, shipped him to New Orleans, got on a riverboat at New Orleans, went up. I think they changed out the whiskey in New Orleans. And when they got into Georgetown, they had to kind of unfold him. And he was buried or taken to the grave wrapped in the regimental flag. And that flag, they did have the presence of mind to take it away from him before they actually buried him. And that flag is hanging as I stand before you this day in the Masonic Lodge, the Georgetown Masonic Lodge. Because Hamer had been master. My father, Jesse, was one of the founding Masons of the Georgetown Lodge. And Hamer had been one of the founders, and they'd both been masters of the lodge. So the lodge got the flag that he was wrapped in for his funeral, the regimental flag, and it hangs on the wall of the lodge to this day. But that was Tom Hamer. Came to Lieutenant Grant and sought help in learning how to be a commander of troops.
After the Mexican War, I made a beeline back to St. Louis, where I was to marry my sweetheart, Julia. Julia was the sister of my West Point roommate, Fred Dent. It was quite a wedding. Turned out her fourth cousin was my best friend, a fellow named James Longstreet. Might have heard of him. Turned out to be the second in command of the Army of Northern Virginia. At this point, we were assigned to various different places. Now, back in those days, pretty much every assignment was a poor assignment. You could be sent up to the Great Lakes, where it was frozen cold in winter. You can be sent to Florida. Florida was one of the worst places to be because everything there wanted to kill you. The insects, the animals, the Indians, the plants, the fleas, everything wanted to kill, the weather. And another place they wanted to post you, and that's where I ended up going, is the West Coast, California, which had just become a state right after the war. And with the 49ers, the state population of California virtually exploded, and they needed Army protection there. The thing was, everything in California cost 3 times what it did back east. So those of us who got posted in California, the Army refused to increase our pay. So I was at various different postings in California. They moved me occasionally, and us junior officers figured out how can we survive on Army pay. And we decided, wouldn't it be good if we planted some vegetables and potatoes and sold those on the side? And then one of us said, we can convert some of this vegetation into alcoholic beverages. So we created our own still. It was a great idea. Unfortunately, one day I just over imbibed in the product and went to work that day. Now, the thing was, I had a family back home, and I dearly missed them, Julie and my oldest son, and in fact, I had a second son born while I was gone, and this put me into a state of depression, and so that's why I had a little bit too much to drink. And I went to work one day, and my commanding officer, Colonel Buchanan, saw that I was not in any shape to be on duty, and we got into a bit of an argument. The offshoot of it was I decided I would leave the Army. I resigned it. Unfortunately, that incident got told over and over and over again. To this very day, many of you think I'm a drunk, but that's what started it. But I didn't care. I just wanted to get out of the Army and go home to my family back in St. Louis.
Well, I resigned in April of 1854. Now, I should tell you that as soon as I got to the West Coast, got in San Francisco in September of 52 and went up to Fort Vancouver, that in October of 52, I wrote a letter to my wife Julia and said, I really want to leave the Army. So as soon as I got to the West Coast, I was already writing home about leaving the Army. Then I got notified in the fall of 53 that I'd been promoted to captain, full captain. Captain Bliss had died. And in those days, we were all in a lockstep of promotion. In order to make a higher rank, somebody above you had to retire or die. And Captain Bliss had died, and I was the next. And now we're talking about Army-wide in the United States. And I was notified I'd been promoted to captain. Now, I had been reading the newspapers. We all had. We knew what was happening down in the southern part of the country and in Washington City. And even though I wanted to leave the Army, I didn't know how I was going to make a living. And that all I could see was poverty staring me in the face, but also all of us, and remember at this time, we're all professional Army. We're all there because we want to be there. And I thought, with what's happening in the eastern half of the country, I need to stay until I can make captain. make Captain Regular Army because I just might need that rank in the future. So on April the 11th of 1854, I got the letter from Secretary of War Jefferson Davis. And it said, you've been promoted to rank of Captain United States Army. And you've got to accept the rank in writing before you've actually got it. So I sat right down and wrote a letter to Secretary of War Davis that I accepted the rank of Captain United States Army. I was captain. And then I wrote a letter resigning from the United States Army and mailed them both the same day. I got on a steamer in San Francisco and I went back to St. Louis. Now, the tales of my travels between Fort Humboldt, California, where I resigned, and getting back to New York City would be another day and another time that I should love to tell you, but not today. I got back to St. Louis, Missouri at Whitehaven, which is where Julia had been born, had been reared, and was living there while I was in the Army in the Pacific West Coast. And I had Fred, our oldest boy, that had been born 2 years old before I left, and our second son, Ulysses S. Grant Jr., Buck, we called him because he was born in Ohio. Our other three children were all born at Whitehaven. Buck was the only one born in Ohio. And as soon as the ladies in attendance with my wife saw that it was a man-child, they said, "Law, it's the son of the Buckeye State." And Julia told me, and at every opportunity still tells me, that as soon as I heard them say that, I said, no, do not call him Buck. No, he's Ulysses Jr., but of course the nickname stuck, and Buck he was, and Buck he still is. And I tried farming. In fact, I told my professional officer friends back in Fort Vancouver in the Oregon Territory and Fort Humboldt in California, there on the coast of Northern California, that when you come looking for me in 10 years, you're going to find an old, successful Missouri farmer. It didn't work out that way. For the next 6 years, I had what I call my years in the wilderness, the next 7, because for 6 years, from 1854 to 1859, or 1860, May of 60, I tried farming. Now, I would have you know that there are people who say that everything I ever tried to do was a failure. I will tell you, I just was not successful. Nothing that I did, no decision I made in farming contributed to my failure. As you will see when I tell you, one year we had a bad winter and everything died. Another year we had a horrible summer and everything died. Another year we had a freeze in early June that killed almost everything in the ground. And then we had a freeze had it in May, and had a freeze in June that everything that wasn't killed in the first one was killed in the second one. Another year we had a bumper crop, and you couldn't give a crop away. And then one year we had the panic of '57, which became a depression that lasted into, until the war started. So try as I might, nothing I was doing farming worked out. And in my defense, I wasn't making bad decisions. Oh, and one year I had a recurrence of malaria that I'd caught going to Oregon, and I had the ague and the fever and a relapse with malaria, and I couldn't get out of bed and get a crop in. So everything beyond my control was causing me to fail as a farmer, and I finally went broke. I just went broke. And I sold it. I talked with my father-in-law, Colonel Dent, and told him I've got to get out of this. And Dent, because we were living in Whitehaven, he'd moved into 4th and Ceres Streets in St. Louis, in their St. Louis townhome. And he was in complete agreement with me getting out of farming. Then I tried being a real estate agent, Boggs and Dent, and I couldn't sell ice water to people in Hades. I'm just not a salesman. And when I tried collecting rent from those old vets from the Mexican War, they tell me their story of why they didn't have the rent, and I'd wind up leaning on the fence post with them, crying with them, and paying their rent. Julia became outraged with me and said, too many nights, Liz, you can't pay their rent. They may have a hard time, but we're having a hard time too, because by now we got 4 children. And I'm getting ever heavier in debt. And I finally, one evening as we're sitting by the fire, Julia out of nowhere says, you've got to do it. And I was reading my paper and I said, looked over the paper and I said, do what? And she said, you've got to write your father the letter. Now I'd already written him a letter asking him for a job and he ignored me. And I said, I won't do it. She said, you've got to, because we're broke. We're going to be on the street. So I wrote my father a letter, and he did give me a job, working with my 2 younger brothers with Grant and Son in Galena, Illinois. So in May, Julia and myself and the 4 children in tow got on the steamer at Tasca and left St. Louis, and I got to Galena, Illinois in May of 1860. Well, the war started in April of 61, and there was a big town hall meeting on the 16th of April, and hundreds of people showed up there, and Galena's not that big of a town, and they harumphed and shouted and stamped and sang patriotic songs, and it was decided that 2 nights later, on the 18th, we would have a recruiting meeting. And so I went to the one 2 nights later. And as I'm sitting there, John Rawlins, a local attorney, says Captain Grant's going to chair the meeting. Now that hit me like a thunderbolt. I had kept a low profile. I didn't know anybody really knew who I was. I was known by the few people that knew me as Captain Grant because I was the only one in town that had any military experience. And I stammered and stuttered and choked and finally got my voice where it would work, and I chaired the meeting. And it was to recruit. Now I did tell them with the fervor that was soaring to the rafters in the building, I did tell them before all of you sign up, I need to tell you about what you're about to get into before you put your name on that dotted line. You need to know that it is not a lark, it is not a scouting trip with your family. It's not an extended picnic. You're going to have hard fare. You're going to sleep on the ground. You're going to be outside in the winter, in the summer. It matters not what the weather's like. You're going to do what you are told. And if you don't like what you're told, you'll do it anyway. And there are channels that you can complain about an order given you by a senior officer, and that is the only way that you're going to complain. So know what you are about before you sign this paper. And there was silence in the crowded hall. And 22 of them stood up to sign up. Every eligible man in the meeting signed up. Now what I didn't know was Elihu Washburn, the congressman for that district, was at the meeting that night. And he later told me, he said, I was as surprised as you were when they picked you to chair the meeting. I didn't know who you were. I thought, why are you picking somebody that nobody knows who he is when you've got so many eligible men? You got John Rawlins, attorney here. But yet they picked you. Maybe that's another one of those ironies in my life. But from that night forward, Elihu Washburn became my champion, and in many instances through the rest of the war, rising up to the rank, the lieutenant general's rank, and he was good friends with President Lincoln, that I saw Washburn's hand in what was happening. And when the Joe Davis Guards, the county was Joe Davis County, they offered me a captaincy in the regiment, and I turned them down, which shocked them. And I said, I'm going to participate in the war in some way or another, but I'm going to decline being a captain in your guards. I think there's more for me in this war than to be a captain of volunteers. And I helped them drill. I sketched out the uniforms for the ladies with the colors of the uniforms and supervised their sewing of the uniforms, because we had to provide our own uniforms. And when the Joe Davis Guards left on April the 25th of '61, got on the cars to go to Springfield, I got on the cars at the end of the train and went to Springfield, Illinois, the state capital. And I did minor jobs. I was just a clerk for a few days, and in disgust, I was going to go home. I had a train ticket for the next morning to go back to Galena. And as I finished my dinner in the hotel across from the state capitol building, and I was smoking a cigar, and Governor Richard Yates comes out, and he walked up to me and said, "Captain Grant." I almost swallowed my cigar, because I knew who he was, but I didn't think he knew who I was, and I particularly was surprised that he knew my rank. Not only did he know who I was, he knew my rank. And when I'd gone to his office to meet him the first day I got there, a week earlier, his clerk, a German immigrant clerk, had not let me see him and had told him I was a scruffy, rugged, ragged-looking fellow and most unimpressive. But yet a few days later, the governor approached me after dinner and said, "Grant, I want to see you in my office in the morning." And after I regained my composure and my shock, I said, "Yes, sir, I will be there first thing in the morning." And things began to change for me.
I would like you to, that was what I was going to say. So continue on through Colonel Good, and then I'll pick it up from there.
Colonel Good. Well, when I went to see Governor Yates the next morning, he said, "I'm going to hire you as a vendor, and you are going to do some recruiting." Now, President Lincoln had set for us to raise a regiment of volunteers for each of the 7 congressional districts in Illinois, plus another one because we had so many recruits or volunteers. So I was given charge of that, the state into 3 sections, and I took the southern part of the state to recruit. Now that was, I thought, shrewd on my part, because I was in Belleville, Illinois, and Mattoon, Illinois, and they're just across the river from St. Louis. My intent was that I would go down, muster in those regiments, and go across the river and see John C. Fremont in command of federal forces in that military district, and see if I couldn't get a colonel's appointment for command of a regiment. And when I got to Mattoon on May the 10th, they were not quite ready. 1,100 young men were going to sign up, but they weren't quite ready. "Can you do it tomorrow?" "Yes, I can." So on May the 11th, or that day, I went over to St. Louis, and I was there when the St. Louis Arsenal, when Captain Lyons, Nathaniel Lyons, attacked the Confederate camp outside of St. Louis. Missouri was a neutral state, and captured all of them, and there was quite a riot about marching those prisoners. I thought it was not the best judgment ever exercised by Nathaniel Lyon when he had 1,000 Confederate prisoners and he marched them through the middle of St. Louis, which was largely a Southern sympathizing town. He had a small federal force, and he marches those prisoners through the middle of St. Louis, and there was a riot that ensued. Several people were killed. I didn't get to see Fremont, but I did get to see Nathaniel Lyons. And that did me no good at all. I went back to Mattoon the next day and swore in mustered in what became the 21st Illinois. Now they went to into camp there in Mattoon. Well, in just a couple of weeks, the governor is contacted, and the people in Mattoon said, "You've got to get these boys out of here. They've stolen every chicken and every pig within 2 miles of the camp. They're tearing down fences and burning them for firewood. They're disrupting the area. Move them to Springfield." And he did. Then they'd appointed Colonel Good, Simon Good, as their colonel. In those days, we elected our officers. Good gets elected as colonel of what became the 21st Illinois. Now, he was a flamboyant fellow, tall, slim. He wore 7 pistols, had 7 holsters hanging off of him. He wore a long cape, black cape with a red silk lining, and he claimed he never slept. He said, "I never sleep. I never close my eyes. I'm like Argus in Greek mythology with 100 eyes. One of them's open all the time. I never sleep." And he would go out and get the fellas and take them in town for drunks and party all night, and then come back and try to do something with them in the daytime, I guess while he was trying not to sleep. And they went to Governor Yates and said, "We've got to have somebody else to command this regiment," because the more they trained what little they did and drilled, they realized he doesn't know what he's doing. So they went to Governor Yates. Now, I'm in Ohio trying to get an appointment as a volunteer colonel. Went to Ohio, was in Indiana. I was desperately trying to get an appointment. When they're in Springfield talking to Governor Yates, he said, "I will not appoint anybody. You tell me who you want, but I refuse to appoint somebody." So they said, "We want Captain Grant." Now, I'd only been with them 1 day. And when I mustered the men, I left. But to this day, there's a park there in Mattoon, Illinois, that's named after Camp Grant. They named their camp Camp Grant. When I left, it's the first thing I ever had named after me. I didn't think I'd impressed them that much, but they named the camp Camp Grant. And they told the governor, "We want Captain Grant." He said, "Well, what you need to do is take a vote." Now, he had all the officers, from the lowest second lieutenant to the lieutenant colonel, because they'd already told Simon Good to get out of the camp. He didn't, but they told him to. And they all voted to a man to elect me as the colonel to command that regiment. And that included the captains and the lieutenant colonel. They all selected me.
Wow.
And I accepted it. When I got to the camp, I ordered Simon Good out and said, "Do not come back." He did leave, and he did not come back. Now, the end of his story would be a year or so later, he was killed robbing a saloon. So maybe they did a good thing getting rid of him that early in the war, but that I replaced Simon Good as the colonel of what now became the 21st Illinois Regiment.
Thank you. I see by the time I'm going to have to abbreviate what I plan to say.
Oh, that's all right, you keep going.
If there's nobody after us,
There's something to 3. I'm not sure. What time are you on?
3 o'clock.
3 o'clock, okay, so not so bad. All right, very good. 21st Illinois became my regiment out of Springfield, Illinois. You always had to go to your state capital to get your commissions and muster in. And so, right before the July 4th holiday, we were sent from Springfield, Illinois to Missouri, which was, as you heard, a slave state, but we need a Union presence in the state. And they wanted me to take the local express train and head to the Mississippi River. And I said, look, these are raw recruits. They need to learn how to march. We're marching there. Now, each of them had been getting their uniforms and equipment and muskets piecemeal, a little at a time, as they could. I, on the other hand, as an officer, had to purchase my own uniform. And I sent my request back to my tailor in Galena, Illinois, for the colonel's uniform. So I'm without a uniform myself, and they're not cheap. It's like a month's pay for a uniform. So we start our trek towards the Mississippi. Our first night, we get to a place called Jacksonville, Illinois, and guess what? It's July 4th. It's a celebration, and we're all invited to join in the party and with the beverages and the food and the pastries that the ladies had made up. And here it is, the first day of my new job. I now have to make a decision because I told them that this is going to be a training march. So I said, we'll have to pass on that, although the ladies did bring some pastries out to camp. And one of the things I told them, I said, no alcohol, because they were consuming that. And I said, I'm going to inspect your canteens. Well, the soldiers, the 21st Illinois, were pretty smart. They filled up the canteens halfway with whiskey, then melted some wax, and then filled on top of that water. So my canteen inspections went for naught. Eventually we made it to Quincy, Illinois, and across the river into Missouri. There was a Confederate regiment on the Palmyra Ridge under Colonel Harris that I was ordered to take. And so I lined up our regiment and ordered them up the hill. As I was going up the hill, I got more and more nervous about this whole thing. My heart was in my throat. I couldn't hardly breathe. I wanted to call a halt to the regiment and go back down the hill because I thought this was going to be a bloodbath. But I didn't even have the courage to do that. And I continued up to the top of the ridge, and Colonel Harris had pulled his troops out. There was nobody there. We'd captured the hill without a fight. And I'm standing there thinking about this. That Colonel Harris was more scared of me than I was of him. That was a valuable lesson I learned for the rest of the war, and never was scared a lick after that. We moved on into Mexico, Missouri, where we set up camp. Most of the men had got their uniforms and muskets by now. And finally, my colonel's uniform arrived. It was like everything was nice and clean. The buttons were shiny and polished, and I had my eagle on my shoulder. And I'm opening up the newspaper to read it. And there on page 2, I read this article. Colonel Grant promoted to Brigadier General. What? Nobody had bothered to tell me. And my first thought was, oh no, I need to buy a new uniform. Oh, I've often wondered how this happened. How I was only a colonel for a couple of months. Well, it turned out my congressman, Washburn, who I told you about, was in Washington visiting his friend, President Lincoln. And as he got in to visit him, he said, "What you doing, Abe?" And he said, "I got this list of colonels, and I gotta promote some to generals, because we just mustered in 300,000 new troops, so we need more officers and more generals, and I don't know who to pick." He looked at this list, saw Grant's name at the bottom. Said, "Take that name and put it on the top." "You know him?" "Yes." "I'll guarantee he'll do a good job." So I not only received a promotion to Brigadier General, but I'm now on top of the seniority list, all the other new ones. And so I get the plum assignment. All the other new generals have to work for some other general. I get my own independent command at a place called Cairo, Illinois. Now, Cairo, Illinois is a sticky, muddy mosquito swamp. Nobody wants to go there. But it's the most strategic point in the United States. It's a confluence of the Mississippi and the Ohio River. Nobody's going to travel on the rivers if they don't control Cairo, Illinois. And that's the assignment I got. And from there on, I now have independent command to do what I with my army. And he will tell you what happened next.
Well, when I got the promotion, I was dismayed in a sense about the uniform. So I gave my colonel's uniform to another officer who did not have his colonel's uniform, and I went to Cairo, Illinois to command the Southern District of Missouri, which was my new command. And I got there wearing civilian clothes because I didn't have a uniform. And I told Colonel Richard Oglesby, who was in command, who I was, and I'm there to take command. And he looked me from boots to hat band and looked like he really didn't believe I was who I said I was. And he kept busy. And then I reached over the bar that was in the bank in St. Louis and the headquarters on the top floor. And I reached across him and pulled a piece of paper off his desk and wrote the orders. This is to instruct that Brigadier General Ulysses S. Grant is in command of the Southern Military District of Missouri and is hereby taking command. And I gave it to Colonel Oglesby, stuck it right in front of his face. And then he seemed to believe me. Although he did telegraph back to Washington and ask about this fellow Grant who says he's a commanding general. Colonel Oglesby and I became great friends. He later became a general under my command. But I immediately got involved in going to Paducah, Kentucky. 2 days later, I got word from a spy who had just got back in town in there at Cairo. And he said, Leonidas Polk, and that's how he pronounces it. It's not Leonidas. The family pronounces it Leonidas. Polk is going to go from Columbus, Kentucky, and march north on Paducah. Well, I would have you know that Leonidas Polk committed what conceivably is one of the greatest blunders committed by the Confederacy of the Civil War, because Kentucky was a neutral state. Well, when the Confederate general and several thousand men marched into Kentucky, that was the Confederacy ignoring the neutrality of Kentucky. And it put Kentucky on a war footing. So I got news from this spy, Arnaud, who said Polk is marching tomorrow on Paducah and going to take it. We couldn't let that happen because Paducah is near where the Tennessee River goes into the Mississippi. And it's also Cairo, a little further south, is where the Mississippi and the Ohio meet. So you've got the Mississippi, the nexus at Paducah. Within just a few miles of Paducah, you've got the nexus of three major rivers in America. The three major rivers in the war, the Tennessee, the Mississippi, and the Ohio. And I felt we cannot let that happen. We cannot let Paducah, Kentucky fall into the hands of the Confederacy. So I marched on it without orders. I did tell General Fremont, if I don't hear anything to the contrary, we're going to march on Paducah. And he didn't send me any orders until after I was already back 2 days later. And he said, take it if you think you can. Well, I've already taken it. So we took Paducah, Kentucky and secured it. And I sent a note to the Kentucky legislature that said, I'm only here to preserve federal citizens' safety and security. You know, this is not an act of war. We're securing Kentucky for you because the foot of the enemy has tread your soil and so forth. So we took Paducah. A couple of months later, I got involved with the first battle that I was in command, Battle of Belmont. And again, that's a battle I fought. Didn't have orders to do it. I was supposed to conduct a demonstration. And when I got close enough to Belmont, which is right across the river from Columbus, Kentucky, Belmont was a sizable Confederate camp, and they were sending troops into Missouri behind troops I had sent into Missouri, Colonel Oglesby, and 3,000 troops. Well, Gideon Pillow and General Pope were sending Confederate troops in there behind Oglesby, and I would not let them get caught with rebels between them and the river, the Mississippi. So I attacked Belmont, and it was the first combat where I was the commanding officer. And we, by the hardest, we won the battle, but I had a horse shot out from under me, and a cooperative lieutenant asked me, well, General, would you like to have my horse? And I said, well, yes, I would, thank you. And I got his horse, and then the Confederates got between us and the river. We had to cut our way through the Confederates, and the boats were already pulling away from the landing, and I had gone down to warn a regiment, come back to the landing. I had told them, stay here until you get orders to come back. Troops getting on the boats, I jumped. It was a learn on the job because I galloped with no escort. I was alone. And I learned don't do that. I galloped down the river to tell this regiment, get back to the boats, and they've already got back to the boats. The colonel and I had a talk. But by this time, the boats are pulling away. I've got several hundred Confederates between me and the river. So I had on, it was a cold day in November, I had on a infantryman's greatcoat, light blue, and I pulled that high collar up, and I was trying to walk my horse through the cornfield and blend in with the corn and hope that I wouldn't be noticed. Well, it turned out, one of the officers, it turned out it was Gideon Pillow, had said, yonder goes the Yankee boys, practice your marksmanship on him. And I knew that my ruse was found. I put the spurs to the horse and galloped away. Not one Confederate soldier so much as raised his musket. They were 50 yards from me. I could have easily been knocked out of the saddle. Not one even raised his rifle. Got to the riverbank. It had been the driest summer in memory. The river was way away from the bank, and the bank was very steep, almost vertical. But my horse seemed to understand the urgency of the matter. And he went front legs over and slid down on his haunches. His haunches were even with my head going down that bank. The captain of the Memphis Bell, Memphis, what's the name of the boat? Bell Memphis recognized me. I'm only the commanding general, and everybody's leaving me. He cut engines. He didn't go back to the riverbank. He cut engines. They ran a plank out, and my horse, once again, seemed to sense the urgency of the matter, and he walked across a plank over that open water and got me on the boat. We'd won the battle only by the hardest. Now, there are those who will tell you I lost that battle, but I will tell you I did not. So I almost was killed twice at the Battle of Belmont, my first battle where I was a commanding officer.
And you had a third time you were almost killed. We were almost killed.
Yes.
Once you were on the ship.
Yes. I walked up the stairs to the captain's cabin right behind the pilot house. And I tried to lay in his bunk, which is up next to I call it the wall, captain's call it the bulkhead. And I lay down in the captain's bed. And I heard some desultory firing and yelling, and I was too charged to lie down. So I got out of the bunk and went out on the deck, and what had happened was some Confederates were on the riverbank firing down, and we were firing back up, and I told my troops, don't do that, they're out of range, you're wasting ammunition. And I went back into the captain's quarters, cabin, to lie down again, and I saw that there was a bullet hole in the bulkhead where my head would have been if I had not gotten up to go see what was. I'd have taken a ball through the head if I hadn't gotten up. So Belmont was a day fraught with danger for me.
I think it's time that we retire, so good night, General Grant.
Good night, President Grant.
You heard many instances, and there were more, where had Grant done something different, he was on a certain path and got deflected to another path, you would never have known the name of Ulysses Grant. You heard some of them here today, and it's quite ironic that Grant became an unlikely hero, commanding officer of all the Union forces, and later on, 8 years as President of the United States. So, with that, you're open for any questions?
If any of you have a question, you don't have to ask one, but if you got a question, we'd be happy to entertain it. I do want to recognize Dr. Gatling here, the inventor, Dr. Gatling, Mrs. Gatling, the inventor of the Gatling gun, that gun that shoots many, many rounds as you crank it.
Thank you, sir.
You grace us with your presence. Thanks for being here. You journeyed far to be a part of this.